Owen Grayson never considered himself the kind of man who would get tangled up in legal battles or bureaucratic nightmares. He was a straightforward guy, a former long-haul trucker who had spent decades on the road before settling down and opening his own small auto repair shop. He liked things simple: work hard, fix what's broken, and stay out of other people's business. His house, a modest single-story home with an attached garage, was more than just a place to sleep. It was his sanctuary, the first real piece of stability he had owned in years, and he took pride in keeping it in perfect condition. That's why when he pulled into his street late one evening, exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the shop, he felt a surge of irritation rather than concern when he first saw the barricades and construction cones set up at the entrance to his driveway. At first, he assumed it was just some routine maintenance. Maybe the city had finally decided to repave the pothole-ridden street, or perhaps the gas company was checking for leaks. But as he slowed down, his headlights illuminated the reality of the situation. His driveway wasn't just obstructed, it was completely dug up. A massive hole, at least 10 feet across and deep enough that he couldn't see the bottom in the dim light, gaped in the center of what used to be his pristine concrete drive. Owen threw the truck into park, yanked the keys from the ignition, and stepped out, his boots crunching against loose gravel. He could already feel his pulse quickening, his tiredness evaporating as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The edges of the hole were lined with neatly stacked piles of dirt, and several orange warning signs had been planted in the ground, each one bearing the same infuriating message: emergency repairs in progress, property owner responsible for restoration costs. His stomach twisted into a knot of frustration. He hadn't received any prior notice, no warning, no explanation. Someone had decided to tear up his property, and now they were telling him that it was his responsibility to fix it? His first instinct was to check his mailbox, hoping for some kind of paperwork that would at least explain what the hell was going on. He stalked up to his porch, rifling through the stack of mail wedged into the box. But there was nothing useful, just a few bills, some junk mail, and a single envelope with an official-looking seal. He tore it open and scanned the letter inside, his jaw tightening as he read, "Dear property owner. As part of ongoing efforts to ensure the safety and long-term structural integrity of the community, a critical assessment of your driveway has determined that immediate excavation was necessary. Due to concerns regarding soil stability and potential subgrade erosion, we have initiated emergency mitigation measures. To proceed with the full restoration of your driveway, a payment of $12,700 must be submitted within the next 14 days to avoid additional late fees or penalties. Please refer to the included documentation for further details." Owen stared at the page, his fingers tightening around the paper. There was no signature, no phone number, nothing but a generic email address at the bottom of the letter. The included documentation was just a single sheet of paper with a vague diagram of his property, a breakdown of estimated repair costs, and a section that ominously read failure to comply may result in extended site restrictions and further legal action. His first thought was to call anyone who could explain what the hell was happening. He pulled out his phone and tried dialing the number listed for property management services, but all he got was an automated menu that eventually dumped him into a voicemail box that was already full. Grinding his teeth, Owen decided to investigate the site himself. He grabbed a flashlight from his truck and stepped cautiously toward the edge of the hole. The closer he got, the more unsettling it became. This wasn't just some slapdash construction job. The excavation was too precise, the edges too clean. Whoever had done this wasn't just patching up a crack in the pavement, they had deliberately dug deep, as if they were searching for something. Shining the flashlight down, he noticed something strange. At the bottom of the hole, beneath layers of freshly turned earth, there was something metallic, smooth and reflecting the light. It was barely visible, but it was there. His gut twisted. This wasn't about soil erosion. Just then, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle made him straighten up. A set of headlights turned onto his street, and a black truck rolled up to the curb, stopping a few feet away. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, a broad-shouldered guy in dark work clothes, clipboard in hand. "Evening," the man said casually, like he hadn't just driven up to a house with a gaping hole in the driveway. "You want to explain to me why the hell there's a crater in my property?" Owen asked, crossing his arms. The man didn't even blink. Routine assessment flagged your driveway as structurally compromised. We had to act fast. Safety reasons. Owen's eyes narrowed. Bullshit. My driveway was fine. I didn't authorize any of this. The man glanced down at his clipboard, flipping through a few pages like he was looking for something. Says here notification was sent out last week. Standard protocol. I didn't get any notification. The man shrugged. That's unfortunate, but the work's already started. No turning back now. Owen clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. What exactly are you fixing? Subsurface issues, the man replied vaguely. Erosion, stability concerns. Nothing you need to worry about, just need you to sign off on the payment so we can wrap it up. Owen exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I'm not paying a damn thing until someone gives me a real explanation. The man gave him a tight-lipped smile. That's your choice, but I wouldn't wait too long. Leaving it open like this? Not exactly ideal for property value. And if it becomes a hazard, well, he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Owen stared at him, every instinct in his body screaming that something wasn't right. I want a second opinion. A real inspector. The man snapped his clipboard shut. Suit yourself. Just don't take too long. These things have a way of getting expensive. With that, he turned, climbed back into his truck, and drove off, leaving Owen standing there, fists clenched. He turned back to the hole, staring down at the metallic object partially buried beneath the dirt. Whatever this was, it wasn't about a cracked driveway. Someone had wanted this hole dug. And if they were willing to strong-arm him into paying for it, that meant they really didn't want him asking questions. Owen had a feeling that this was only the beginning. Owen barely slept that night. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with a relentless mix of frustration and unease. Every logical part of him wanted to believe this was just an overreach, some bureaucratic nonsense where a few overzealous contractors had decided to justify their budget by tearing up his driveway. But that didn't explain the way the man had spoken to him, the smug certainty in his voice, the way he had treated Owen's objections as nothing more than an inconvenience. And it definitely didn't explain the metallic object buried beneath the dirt, glinting faintly in the beam of his flashlight. By the time the first slivers of dawn crept through his blinds, Owen had made a decision. He wasn't going to let them steamroll him. He wasn't the type to roll over and accept a situation just because some suit with a clipboard said so. If they thought they could intimidate him into compliance, they were about to learn otherwise. The first thing he did that morning was call the city's planning department. He was determined to find out whether there was any actual record of an order to dig on his property. After wading through several automated menus, he was finally connected to a bored-sounding clerk who barely listened as Owen explained his situation. The man took his address, put him on hold for nearly 10 minutes, then returned with an answer that made Owen's blood run cold. There's no record of any authorized excavation at that location, the clerk said. If someone's doing work, they didn't go through the city for approval. Owen tightened his grip on his phone. Are you sure? I have paperwork saying this was an emergency assessment. The clerk let out a dry chuckle. Sounds like someone's feeding you a line. If it's a real emergency, there'd be a permit. If there's no permit, it's not official. You might want to get a lawyer involved. Owen's stomach twisted. He thanked the man and hung up, then immediately dialed the number from the letter he had received. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again, same result. Now his unease was growing into something closer to anger. Whoever these people were, they had moved fast, and they weren't interested in explaining themselves. Determined to get answers, he threw on a jacket and headed outside. The air was crisp, the morning quiet, but his driveway was just as wrecked as the night before. A fresh wave of frustration surged through him as he stepped up to the edge of the hole, peering down into the dark, compacted dirt. The metallic surface was still visible, just barely a smooth, curved structure buried deeper than any simple pipe should be. Before he could think better of it, he grabbed a shovel from his garage and climbed down, his boots kicking up loose dirt as he dropped into the hole. He worked quickly, jabbing the shovel into the soil and tossing it aside in hurried scoops. The more he dug, the more the object revealed itself. It wasn't just a pipe, it was a hatch. A thick, reinforced panel of metal with rusted bolts along the edges. It didn't look like utility infrastructure. It looked old, out of place. Owen ran a hand over the surface, wiping away a layer of dust and grime. There was no label, no markings, no indication of what it was. His heart pounded as his fingers traced the edge of a recessed handle. Whatever this thing was, someone had gone to a lot of trouble to bury it, and now someone else had gone to a lot of trouble to dig it up without telling him why. He exhaled sharply, stepping back, his mind racing. He needed to document this. If they were going to force him to pay for something he never agreed to, he damn well wanted proof of what they were doing. He reached into his pocket for his phone, but before he could take a picture, the rumble of an approaching engine made him freeze. A black SUV rolled up to the curb, tires crunching softly against the pavement. Owen barely had time to process it before the passenger door opened and a man stepped out, someone different from the guy last night, but wearing the same dark work clothes. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about his posture that set Owen on edge. The man didn't move aggressively, but there was an unmistakable authority in the way he approached. "You shouldn't be down there," he said, voice calm but firm. Owen narrowed his eyes but didn't climb out of the hole. "It's my damn property." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response. "That's up for debate." Owen's jaw clenched. "Not really. I've lived here for 5 years. My name's on the deed." The man didn't argue. Instead, he sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw like this was some minor annoyance in his day. "Look, I get it. This is frustrating. But this work isn't optional, and it's not negotiable. It needs to be completed. And if I were you, I wouldn't get in the way." Owen climbed out of the hole, shoving the shovel into the dirt for emphasis. "And if I refuse?" The man gave a small, humorless smile. "Then this is going to become a much bigger headache for you." Owen stared at him, a slow, simmering anger burning in his gut. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice," the man said, his smile never faltering. "This whole thing? It's bigger than you. Bigger than this property. You can either let us do our job and move on with your life, or you can make things harder for yourself. Your call." Owen took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Then explain it to me. What's down there?" The man's smile faded. "You don't want that answer." Owen took a step closer. "Try me." The man studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're not going to back down, are you?" Owen shook his head. The man exhaled, glanced over his shoulder at the SUV, then looked back at Owen. "You ever hear the saying, 'Let sleeping dogs lie'?" Owen didn't respond. "Some things are buried for a reason," the man said quietly, "and not everything needs to be dug up." Before Owen could reply, the driver of the SUV honked the horn short, sharp, impatient. The man turned toward the vehicle, then back to Owen with one final look. "I'd walk away from this if I were you." Then he climbed into the SUV, the door slamming shut behind him. The vehicle pulled away, leaving Owen standing there, fists clenched, pulse pounding in his ears. He turned back to the hole, to the hatch buried beneath the dirt, and realized something with absolute certainty. They weren't digging to fix something. They were digging to find something. And whatever it was, they didn't want him knowing about it. Owen stood motionless by the edge of the hole for a long time, his mind caught in a tangled mess of frustration, suspicion, and something he wasn't ready to call fear not yet. He watched the black SUV disappear down the street, its taillights glowing dimly in the early morning haze, and knew one thing for certain: whatever was happening here, it wasn't about a simple driveway repair. The man's words echoed in his head, the casual warnings layered with something deeper, something that felt less like a suggestion and more like an unspoken rule he was expected to follow. But Owen had never been the kind of man to walk away from a problem just because someone told him to. In fact, the more he was pushed, the more stubborn he became. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and took several photos of the hole, zooming in on the exposed metal hatch. He made sure to capture the unnatural precision of the excavation, the way the dirt had been carefully piled along the edges instead of haphazardly dumped. This wasn't an emergency dig, this was planned, controlled. Someone had known exactly where to dig and exactly what they were looking for. He scrolled through the images, making sure they were clear, then emailed them to himself and saved copies to the cloud. If things started to go south, he wanted proof. A cold wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth, and Owen shivered, though he wasn't sure if it was from the chill or from the growing realization that he had just stepped into something much bigger than himself. He needed to think. The first logical step was to confirm what he already suspected, that whoever had dug this hole hadn't bothered with proper permits. He had already called the city's planning department once, but now he needed more than just a phone conversation. He needed hard evidence. He locked up his house, climbed into his truck, and drove downtown to the municipal building, pushing through the revolving doors into the sterile, fluorescent-lit lobby. The place smelled like old paper and stale coffee, and a bored-looking receptionist barely glanced up as he approached the counter. "I need to check for any excavation permits issued for my property," Owen said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "It's urgent." The receptionist sighed, tapped a few keys on her computer, and asked for his address. He gave it to her and waited while she scrolled through whatever database held the city's records. After a moment, she frowned and shook her head. "Nothing's been filed," she said. "No active work orders, no pending applications. Are you sure the work is city approved?" "Pretty damn sure it's not," Owen muttered. "Can I get a printout of that?" She hesitated but eventually nodded, pressing a few buttons before a nearby printer hummed to life, spitting out a single-page document. She handed it to him, and Owen barely resisted the urge to smirk. This was proof, undeniable evidence that the dig on his property was unauthorized. Whoever was behind it, they weren't operating through legal channels. "One more thing," he said, tucking the paper into his jacket. "Can you check if there's ever been any historical zoning records on my property? Old maps, previous construction permits, anything." The receptionist raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. She clicked through a few more screens, then shook her head again. Nothing unusual. House was built in the 80s, standard residential zoning. No major underground infrastructure, no recorded hazards. Just a normal lot. "Right," Owen said, though his gut told him otherwise. "Thanks for your help." He left the building feeling both satisfied and more unsettled than before. If there were no records of underground infrastructure, then what the hell was that hatch doing beneath his driveway? It was too deliberate, too secure to be some forgotten relic. Someone had put it there for a reason. And now someone else wanted it uncovered. By the time he got back home, the sun was fully up, casting sharp morning light across his ruined driveway. To his surprise, the worksite wasn't abandoned. Two men in construction gear different from the ones he had seen the night before were standing near the hole, talking in low voices. One of them was holding a clipboard, the other gesturing toward the exposed metal beneath the dirt. Owen parked his truck and stepped out, slamming the door harder than necessary. Both men looked up. "You're trespassing," Owen said flatly. "This is my property, and you don't have permission to be here." The man with the clipboard, a wiry guy with graying hair and a permanent scowl, didn't look impressed. "We're just finishing up," he said, his tone dismissive. "We'll be out of your way soon." "Finishing up what?" Exactly, Owen crossed his arms. "Because as far as I can tell, this hole wasn't supposed to be here in the first place." The second man, younger, stockier, shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we're just doing what we were told. We're not the ones calling the shots." Owen narrowed his eyes. "Then who is?" Neither man answered. The older one glanced at his clipboard like it held the secret to avoiding this conversation. "All right," Owen said, his patience wearing thin. "Then let me make this clear. You're on my land, digging up my property, and you have no legal authorization to be here. I've already checked with the city. There's no permit for this work. So unless you want to explain to the cops why you're trespassing, I suggest you start talking." That got their attention. The younger man looked nervous now, his eyes darting toward his partner as if waiting for permission to speak. But the older man just exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Fine, he said. You want answers? You're looking in the wrong place. We're not the problem here. Owen clenched his jaw. Then who is? Instead of answering, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He hesitated for just a second before handing it over. Consider this a favor, he said, and don't say we didn't warn you. Owen took the paper, unfolding it carefully. It was a printout of an old newspaper article, yellowed and faded but still legible. The headline made his breath catch. Local project shut down after unexplained incident, site sealed indefinitely. The article was dated nearly 40 years ago. It mentioned an excavation project that had been abruptly halted after unforeseen complications. There were vague references to a sealed access point and structural concerns, but no details. Whatever had happened, someone had made damn sure the public never got the full story. Owen looked up, but the men were already gathering their tools, packing up as quickly as they could. Who gave you this? Owen demanded. The older man gave him a long, measuring look. Just walk away, man, he said. You don't want to end up like the others. Before Owen could ask what the hell that meant, they were gone. Their truck rumbled down the street, leaving him alone with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. He turned back to the hole, gripping the newspaper article so tightly his knuckles turned white. Whatever had been buried beneath his driveway, someone had wanted it to stay hidden. And now that it was uncovered, Owen had a feeling he wasn't the only one watching. Owen stood by the hole, gripping the old newspaper article so tightly that the edges crumpled in his hands. His breath came slow and steady, but inside his mind was racing. The weight of what he had just learned pressed down on him like a lead blanket. Someone had been here before decades ago. Someone had dug, found something they weren't supposed to, and then covered it up so completely that there was no official record of it ever happening. And now someone else had come back to unearth whatever had been buried, working in the shadows, using legal intimidation and bureaucratic loopholes to keep him from asking questions. The problem was, Owen wasn't the kind of man to let things go just because someone told him to. If they wanted him to stay quiet, that meant they were afraid of what he might find, and that made him want to dig even deeper. He took a slow breath and forced himself to think rationally. He needed to approach this smart. Whoever these people were, they clearly had resources. They had the power to dig up private property without a permit, manipulate city records, and make things happen without leaving a trace. If they had that kind of pull, then going to the police was pointless. Even if an officer took him seriously, the people behind this could shut it down before an investigation even started. No, he needed to be careful. He needed to figure out what was really going on before he made his next move. He stepped back from the hole, folded the newspaper carefully, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. His first priority was to find out if anyone else knew about this someone who had been around long enough to remember what had happened here. The article mentioned an excavation project from 40 years ago, which meant there had to be survivors, people who had worked on it or lived nearby when it happened. He decided to start with the oldest person he knew in the neighborhood, Jim Carson, who had lived on this street since the 70s. Owen walked across the street and knocked on Jim's door. It took a minute, but eventually the old man answered, peering through the screen door with tired, weathered eyes. Owen, Jim said, his voice rough with age. What brings you by? Owen hesitated for only a second before pulling the folded newspaper from his pocket and holding it up. I need to ask you about something, he said, something that happened a long time ago. Jim's eyes flickered to the paper, and in that moment, Owen saw something he didn't expect: recognition. The old man's jaw tightened, and for a brief second, he looked like he was about to tell Owen to go to hell. Then he sighed, stepped back, and gestured for Owen to come inside. The house smelled like old wood and coffee, a relic of a different era. Jim motioned for Owen to sit, then took the newspaper, unfolding it slowly, his fingers tracing the faded ink like he was touching a ghost. I never thought I'd see this again, he muttered. What do you know? Owen asked, leaning forward. Jim exhaled sharply. More than I should, he admitted, and not enough to really understand it. Try me, Owen said. The old man set the paper down and laced his fingers together. Back in '82, there was a project government contract, but no one really knew what for. Officially, it was some kind of geological survey, but nobody believed that. They brought in specialists, not just contractors. Scientists, military types, people who didn't belong in a simple dig site. Then, overnight, everything stopped. The site was shut down, fenced off, and within a month, it was like nothing had ever been there. The workers were paid off. Some relocated, some just disappeared. The few who stayed, well, they didn't talk about it. And those who did, he trailed off, shaking his head. Owen frowned. What happened to them? Jim hesitated. Strange things. Accidents. One guy got hit by a car, another burned his house down. A couple just packed up and left town without a word. I don't know if it was coincidence, but it was enough to make people shut up. He looked at Owen, his expression grave. You want my advice? Leave it alone. There's a reason it got buried. Owen clenched his jaw. That's the problem, Jim. It's not buried anymore. Someone's digging it back up, and they're using my property to do it. Jim's face darkened. Then you've got a real problem, son. Owen left the house more unsettled than when he arrived. If what Jim said was true, then this wasn't just about some forgotten structure under his driveway. It was something people had been willing to kill for. He had been right to be cautious. He needed to figure out who was behind this and what they were after, and he needed to do it before they realized just how much he knew. By the time he got back to his house, the work site was completely abandoned. No workers, no equipment, just the open hole, yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Something about it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It felt wrong, like an invitation he wasn't sure he wanted to accept. Still, he had to know. He climbed down into the hole, flashlight in hand, and ran his fingers over the hatch again. It was sealed tight, but there had to be a way to open it. He traced the edges, looking for a latch or a mechanism, and then he found it a small, recessed panel with a keyhole. Not a modern electronic lock, but something older, mechanical. Whatever was down there, it had been locked away with intent. Owen exhaled slowly. This was it. The moment where he decided whether to turn back or keep pushing forward. Every instinct told him he was playing with fire, that he was about to step into something he couldn't walk away from. But it was too late for second thoughts. They had forced him into this. They had made it personal. He needed a key. And something told him the people who had dug up his driveway already had it. He climbed out of the hole, dusted himself off, and locked his front door behind him. If they wanted to play games, he was ready. But this time, he wasn't just going to sit back and wait for them to make the next move. It was his turn to start digging. Owen didn't sleep that night. He sat in his truck, parked a few houses down from his own, watching the dark silhouette of his property through the windshield. The hole in his driveway was a gaping wound, an open invitation for whoever was orchestrating this mess to return under the cover of darkness. And they did. It was past 2 in the morning when he saw movement. A blacked-out van rolled silently up the street and stopped in front of his house. 3 figures stepped out, dressed in dark clothing, moving with purpose. They weren't construction workers, not at this hour, and certainly not without any visible equipment. Owen gripped the steering wheel, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he watched them approach the excavation site. They weren't here to finish the job, they were here for something else. He fought the urge to intervene right away. He needed to see what they were after. The men circled the hole, speaking in hushed voices. One of them knelt, reaching down toward the metal hatch, and Owen's stomach twisted when he saw the brief flash of something in his hand, a key. They had it. The way in. Owen had seen enough. He killed the engine and moved fast, stepping out of the truck with careful, deliberate quiet. His boots barely made a sound against the pavement as he crossed the street. The men were too focused on their task to notice him approaching. He was 20 feet away when one of them glanced up, freezing mid-movement. "Hey," Owen called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "You boys looking for something?" They reacted instantly. The man with the key shoved it back into his pocket, and the others straightened, exchanging quick, silent glances. One of them, taller than the rest, took a step forward. "This is private business," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You should go back inside." Owen let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're standing in my damn driveway, next to a hole you people dug without permission. So why don't you tell me what's really going on before I call the cops?" The man sighed, shaking his head like he was dealing with a stubborn child. "You don't want to do that." Yeah, Owen took another step closer. "Why's that?" Before he could react, the shorter man on the left moved. Fast. Too fast. Owen barely had time to register the motion before the guy grabbed him by the arm and twisted. Pain shot up his shoulder as he was yanked off balance, but years of hauling heavy equipment had made him stronger than most men. He twisted with the motion, using the momentum to shove his attacker back. The man stumbled, but the tall one was already closing in, reaching into his jacket. Owen didn't wait to find out what he was reaching for. He threw a punch, landing a solid hit to the guy's jaw, sending him staggering backward. The third man, the one with the key, hesitated for just a second too long. That was all Owen needed. He lunged, grabbing the guy by the collar and slamming him against the side of the van. "What the hell is under there?" Owen growled, tightening his grip. "What are you people looking for?" The man's expression remained eerily blank, like none of this surprised him. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice even despite the fact that Owen had him pinned. "This isn't something you want to be involved in." Owen gritted his teeth. Too late for that. The guy didn't resist, didn't fight back, and that set off alarm bells in Owen's head. Before he could react, the taller man recovered from the punch and pulled something from his jacket, a small black device. He pressed a button, and suddenly Owen's world exploded in white-hot pain. A taser. His muscles seized, his body locked up, and he hit the ground hard, his vision swimming. He barely registered the sound of the van door slamming shut, the engine roaring to life. Tires screeched against asphalt, and by the time the pain subsided enough for him to move, they were gone. Owen lay there for a long moment, chest heaving. His limbs still tingled from the electric shock, but his mind was racing. They had the key. They had the access. And now they knew he wasn't going to back off. He forced himself to his feet, stumbling slightly as he caught his breath. His first instinct was to check the hole, but something else caught his eye, something lying on the pavement a few feet away. A single key. They had dropped it in the scuffle. Owen picked it up with unsteady fingers, turning it over in his palm. It was heavy, industrial, nothing like a house key. His stomach clenched. This was it. The way in. For a moment he considered calling anyone before opening that hatch. But who could he trust? The police were useless. The city wouldn't acknowledge the dig. The only people who knew what was going on were the ones trying to keep him out of it. So Owen did the only thing that made sense. He opened the damn hatch. The lock clicked with a sickening finality, and the metal groaned as he lifted it open. A rush of stale air hit him, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic. The hatch opened into a narrow, reinforced tunnel, descending steeply into darkness. Owen hesitated, gripping the edge of the hatch, every instinct screaming at him to think this through, but he had already passed the point of no return. He grabbed a flashlight from his truck, took a steadying breath, and climbed down. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough to stand upright, the walls lined with thick metal plating. This wasn't some old sewage line or forgotten infrastructure. This was built to last. As he moved deeper, his footsteps echoed against the metal. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed down on him like a physical weight. He passed rusted pipes, corroded panels, and then finally reached a door. It was heavy, military-grade, with no markings except for a faded emblem near the center. Owen traced it with his fingers, his breath catching when he realized what it was. A government insignia. Whatever was behind this door, it wasn't meant to be found. And he had just found it. Owen stood in front of the reinforced door, his breath steady but his pulse hammering against his ribs. The metal was ice cold beneath his fingers, rough with age but still sturdy, as if it had been built to withstand decades of time and pressure. The faded government insignia was barely visible, its edges worn down, but its presence alone sent a chill through him. This wasn't just an abandoned structure. It was something buried, something meant to stay hidden. And now, against every warning, every instinct that told him to walk away, he was standing at its threshold. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, angling the beam upward, scanning the door for a handle or keypad, anything that would suggest how it opened. At first it seemed seamless, but then he spotted a thick, rusted lever near the center, bolted into the steel. Owen hesitated, his fingers hovering over it. If he did this, there was no turning back. He had already been attacked once. Whoever had gone to such lengths to excavate this site wasn't going to let him just walk away with answers. But that was the thing, he wasn't sure he could walk away without them anymore. He exhaled, braced himself, and pulled the lever down. The mechanism resisted at first, but then something inside released with a deep, mechanical groan. Dust billowed into the air as the door shifted, the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing through the narrow tunnel. Then, with a final hiss of escaping air, the door cracked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Owen swept his flashlight inside, illuminating a corridor that stretched further than his beam could reach. The walls were the same reinforced metal as the tunnel, but lined with rows of old conduit and rusted pipes. This wasn't just some forgotten bunker. It had been functional once active. He stepped inside cautiously, the sound of his boots muffled by a thin layer of dust coating the floor. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of something long sealed away. The hallway branched off into several smaller rooms, their doors ajar, revealing abandoned workspaces. Desks covered in dust, chairs knocked over, old yellowed papers scattered across the floor. He scanned the room with his light, catching glimpses of faded documents pinned to corkboards, schematics curling at the edges, unreadable notes scribbled in margins. Then he saw the symbol again. On the far wall, painted in bold black lettering, was the same insignia from the door, but beneath it, partially obscured by grime, were words that sent a shiver through him. Subterranean Research Division Site 23. Research. This wasn't just a bunker, it had been an operational facility. But what the hell had they been researching? Owen stepped further inside, scanning the desks for anything intact. Most of the files had been left to decay, but in the far corner a metal filing cabinet stood untouched. He crouched, forcing open the rusted drawers, rifling through thick binders and brittle pages. Most of it was technical engineering reports, geological surveys, but then he found something else. A memo, dated decades ago, effective immediately. All personnel are to evacuate Site 23 and cease all ongoing research. Access to lower containment has been restricted indefinitely following Incident 0. No further excavation is to be authorized under any circumstances. Any breach of protocol will be met with immediate federal intervention. Destroy all remaining documentation. This is not a request. Owen stared at the paper, the words sinking into his mind like lead weights. Incident 0. Restricted indefinitely. Federal intervention. This wasn't just some long-abandoned government project. Something had happened here, something bad enough to shut the whole place down and bury it. He turned back to the hall, following the corridor deeper, past more open rooms, each one a time capsule of whatever had transpired here. He passed what looked like a break area, a small security station, then another heavy metal door at the very end of the hall. This one was marked Authorized Personnel Only Containment Level. Containment. Owen's pulse quickened. His gut screamed at him to stop, to turn back, but he wasn't listening anymore. He reached for the handle, but before he could even touch it, the sound of movement. Not behind him. From the other side of the door. Owen froze. His flashlight trembled slightly as he kept the beam fixed forward. It had been faint, almost imperceptible, but he had heard it, a shift, a scrape, something shifting in the darkness beyond. The facility was supposed to be abandoned. Nothing should have been down here. He took a slow step back, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone he was. The tunnel leading up to the surface felt impossibly far away. His breathing was too loud. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. Then, another noise, not movement this time. A click, like a lock being undone. Owen turned and ran. He sprinted back through the corridor, past the decayed offices and rusted pipes, his flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. His boots slammed against the floor as he lunged for the exit, his only thought to get out before whatever was back there reached him. He reached the hatch and scrambled up the ladder, gripping the cold rungs with shaking hands. The air outside felt impossibly fresh as he hauled himself up, collapsing onto the dirt beside the open hole. He barely took a breath before slamming the hatch shut and twisting the key back into place. He stumbled back, staring at the metal door as if expecting it to burst open. But it didn't. The silence returned, stretching out into the night, but Owen knew what he had heard. The facility wasn't empty. Something was still down there. Owen sat on the ground, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts as his fingers dug into the dirt beneath him. The cold night air did little to settle the heat in his chest, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins like fire. His body was telling him to run, to put as much distance between himself and that hatch as possible, but his mind refused to let go of what had just happened. There had been something down there. Not just echoes of the past, not just remnants of an abandoned site. Something had moved. Something had unlocked the door from the other side. And the worst part, Owen had no idea if he had been the one to wake it up. He forced himself to his feet, his legs still shaking slightly as he backed away from the hole. His first instinct was to bury it, throw dirt over it, seal it with concrete, do something to make sure it never opened again. But the rational part of his mind knew that wasn't going to work. Whoever had been digging in his driveway had done it for a reason. They had been looking for something specific. And now that they knew the entrance was accessible, they weren't going to stop. Owen wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing around the empty street. No sign of the van, no sign of anyone watching. But that didn't mean he was alone. He needed to act fast. He made his way back into the house, locking the door behind him before heading straight for his laptop. His hands were still trembling as he typed, pulling up records, searching for anything connected to Site 23. But like before, there was nothing. No mention of containment levels, no incident zero, nothing about a government research division operating in this area. It was as if the facility had been erased from history. But Owen had proof now. He grabbed his phone, quickly flipping through the photos he had taken inside. The abandoned offices, the sealed containment door, the memo ordering the shutdown. He sent copies to multiple cloud backups, attached them to an email draft, and left it open on his screen. If something happened to him, he wanted a trail. Then, a noise outside. A car engine. Slow. Approaching. Owen moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to see. A black SUV. Not speeding this time, not trying to make a quick getaway. It pulled up to the curb, idling in the dim glow of the streetlights. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. Not one of the workers. Someone else. Owen recognized him immediately. The man from the city office. The one who had told him no records existed. Owen's grip on the curtain tightened as the man lit a cigarette, exhaling a slow stream of smoke before glancing up directly at Owen's window. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, as if he had expected to find Owen standing there, waiting. Owen's stomach twisted. The man didn't approach the house. He simply took another drag from his cigarette, then flicked it onto the pavement. When he finally spoke, his voice was just loud enough to carry across the quiet street. "You should have left it alone." Then he got back in the SUV and drove away. Owen stayed at the window long after the taillights disappeared, his pulse a steady, heavy thud in his ears. The message was clear. This wasn't over. They weren't arresting him. They weren't trying to silence him. Not yet. They were watching. Owen exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think through the panic clawing at his chest. He could leave. Pack a bag, disappear before things escalated further, but that wasn't who he was. He wasn't the kind of man who ran. Instead, he turned back to his laptop. If they were watching him, fine, let them. But he was watching too, and he was going to find out exactly what was buried under Site 23.